And
Great.
let's see, I click on you, and there we are, both of us. I'm looking at my screen, and I'm so excited. So
That's
thanks for
cool.
meeting me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
What has it been? Almost 10 years since
Yeah,
the release of fourth edition.
yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, there's so many different things, but in all this time, I think that I have a pretty good understanding, or at least some ideas about this history. But everybody seems to know a little bit, and it's hard to get a straight answer. I don't know if you agree. I was interested in some of the things you had to say, but one thing that I think is the case is that it was ridiculous to come up with a new edition of Dungeons and Dragons as a promotional idea in that short amount of time. I mean, it's as I'm arguing, Dungeons and Dragons is more of a religion than a game. And I don't mean it as a metaphor. I mean like an actual folk religion. And you know, people could be brought up in third edition and think of themselves as having been raised in it. But to do that again right away, I mean, it's not really possible.
Mm,
It's not a Barbie. Hasbro thinks they're working with a Barbie, and it's not. You can't just put it in a new box. You
mm.
know, and that's part of it. And then there's other things too. Um, but anyway, so tell me, we're talking about fourth edition, whatever we feel like saying. So feel free.
Okay, so yeah, I wouldn't go as far as to call it a religion myself, but I kind of see what you're going for with that um, direction of thinking. I'm sorry, my throat is a bit
That's fine.
sore. Because yeah, like full disclaimer, I haven't played a lot of fourth edition.
Hmm.
I ran a couple of games and I played in one campaign, basically. So I don't have a lot of experience with it. But yeah, I was one of those people who were raised in third edition.
Oh, you were okay, right?
Yeah,
You
like
know
it
I'm
was.
ancient, right?
No,
So
but also like I'm from Slovenia, so there wasn't really a role-playing culture
right.
before that here.
Hmm.
At least not widely spread, or maybe pockets here and there.
Hmm.
But when third edition came out, um, we found these books in our local video store, I think, actually.
Right. That actually makes sense.
Yeah, we didn't even have an idea that
Right.
there could be like a hobby of role playing or
We used
anything
to
like
when I
that.
was a kid, you could buy D&D in what we called the head shops, where you bought pipes for marijuana. That's where,
Great,
record
great
stores,
stuff.
the all the underground record stores and stuff. You had
Mm,
D&D. Yeah.
yeah, it was the place where we used to buy like our metal records, and
Right. Right.
suddenly
Yeah.
they had D&D.
Makes
It's
perfectly good
that kind
sense. Yeah.
of thing. And yeah, so we started playing, and we mostly just played D&D for a very long time. Then we eventually found Vampire and all the other stuff. Classic
Right.
story. But yeah, my experience was that as third edition progressed, this was basically my argument that I made
Oh
when
yeah.
you
Yeah. I want to. Yeah.
met me. It was kind of like a three-part argument that as third edition progressed, it kind of ran into a bunch of problems that kind of emerged from that design. Or
Hmm.
not even problems, maybe just kind of player behaviors that were supported by the rules and so on.
Right.
And I think fourth edition tried to fix a lot of those. And like, if we accept that it fixed those things, why did it quote unquote fail? And I think the reason for this negative reaction to fourth edition was, like you said, kind of comparing it to a religion, maybe not because of its mechanics and its rules, but because how it came into the public's
Right.
opinion,
It
and
was
the public eye.
so obviously a product.
Yeah, yeah. They marketed it a certain way that kind of rubbed people the wrong way, and also afterwards, when the actual books came out, they were presented in a certain way and stuff that I think all these aesthetic elements also
Yes.
cause this negative reaction. Like if you look at could grab a book, but I'm not gonna bother.
Right.
If you look at the page spread from 4th edition Player's Handbook, like in the fighter class section, you get 2 pages of just powers on white pages, and you have these little boxes of text that's highly technical, very full of jargon, like push, slide,
Right.
1 square, etc. And you look at that, and it doesn't. The first thing that pops into your mind is not like, wow, high adventure of sword and sorcery. It's just
Right.
rules.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this format that they put the rules in was way more influential in generating this negative reaction
Right.
than what the actual mechanics were.
Right. This is the. Didn't somebody in that thread talk about how, if you look at 5th edition, you'll see a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the exact same rules, but they've been given much more colorful or naturalistic language.
Yeah, they've been kind of massaged into
Right.
a,
Right.
yeah.
Now, the other thing I was going to
And
say that I was going to ask you before you went on was what you mentioned player behaviors in playing 3rd edition. That
mhm.
what did you have in mind? What were some examples?
Well, for example, one of the things that keeps coming up even now, 10 years later, or even more than 10 years later, is the use of wands of cure light wounds. It's
Oh,
basically like this insane meme. When we started playing, nobody was using wands of cure light wounds.
hmm
But then year after year, as the games went on, we just, I don't know, maybe we picked it up from some online forum or something. It just became necessary for the party to have
right,
a wand of cure light wounds
right,
because it was extremely cheap and it provided a lot of healing.
right. It reminds me a little bit of this is perhaps a more dramatic example. In long, long ago D&D,
Yeah.
the only way you got spells was to find them in the dungeons.
Hmm.
And so when you were 5th level, the wizard was now able to cast Fireball. And
Hmm.
so it was expected that the dungeon master would have to put a Fireball spell in the dungeon for easy access as soon as possible because we need that Fireball spell. And if you don't give it to us, it's not fair.
Hmm.
We owe you owe us, you know. And so it just became a given that all Dungeons and Dragons parties at 5th level and above had Fireball. Period.
Hmm.
It
Yeah,
was
exactly. This kind of
unacceptable. Unacceptable.
expected
Right. Right.
behavior. And to segue from that into 4th edition, like they introduced healing surges,
Yes. hmm
which I think were exactly a response to that kind of play. They said, okay, players expect to have some kind of reliable, cheap healing in between fights,
hmm
and giving them wands is kind of stupid. Let's
Right.
just
Right.
give the classes some kind of,
Right.
you know, personal resource to heal.
Everybody gets their healing surges at the basic level, and then you have your clerics or leaders who have this enhancing
Who boost that?
capacity.
Yeah, but
Yeah. So there's another interesting feature to this, which is often brought up in certain venues, which is the purposes of play. Now, my argument, which I don't know if you have sat through my Finding D&D videos, they're making 5 of them. I've put out 3.
I think I watched too.
Well, I appreciate that. That's more than more than I expect. So I appreciate that. But the one of my arguments that may not be too apparent until the whole thing is done is the argument about story. And it's
Mhm.
related to so many things from the 80s. It's related to the fact that fantasy fiction became these endless series and the blend between writing books that were really promoting a role-playing game versus writing role-playing games just because somebody had written books.
Okay,
Those were
yeah.
starting to all become the same thing all at once. And so fantasy was becoming like D&D. No, in other words, instead of Dungeons and Dragons celebrating your knowledge of fantasy, it had become its own kind of fantasy, and that was becoming the most common. So all this was happening. So I'm talking about the transition from Dragonlance to Forgotten Realms, and then to the way that you were supposed to play any of the box sets like Dark Sun or Spelljammer or anything like that. And it all had to do with this genius GM who is channeling the publisher and the novels. And then you, as the player, got to be in it, you know? And that was the story. You played to find the story. And that's where all that stuff, and then computer gaming started in the 1990s in a certain way, a certain new kind of computer gaming. That's when you're getting all that Baldur's Gate stuff, and everything sort of takes on this very powerful sense of what fantasy is and how you do it, that was alien to me, and I had no part in this. But third edition adopted all that older material, and then fourth edition for some reason does it too. Looking at the way that fourth edition plays, looking at the way that you strategize, the way that you work with your characters, what does that have to do with the Forgotten Realms? Nothing. It has everything to do with the older material, like Arduin Grimoire, which wasn't TSR, but anything like really intense. One of the things I like about fourth edition is, and remember, I came in late, so I actually encountered it through the third player's handbook, not through the first. So to me, this was wonderful psychedelic craziness, in comparison. That there's something very strange about trying to bring the older canonical material into fourth edition. If you're going to do something that new, that fast, and that different, then why not create a completely different set of imagined material? I mean, you can see what they're going for. They had all this intellectual property. They're not going to give it up. But it just seems very silly not to just treat it as a completely new thing with new fantasy of its own, especially when it's so well suited to something new. I mean,
honestly,
yeah.
Sorry.
Well, I mean, maybe I'm asking too much. I mean, you can't retroactively tell people what they should have done.
Yeah,
but I guess, and part of it's my own history. I came into it looking at all these really psychedelic, really intense psionic classes, and I also picked up, the Dungeon Master's Guide 2 is very different. It's very, very flexible, very oriented toward players being able to drive things with their quests and skill challenges and stuff like that. And so, go ahead.
Well, I kind of have two things to say, so
no,
finish.
That's fine. No, well, I'm only saying that from my perhaps very biased or unique perspective in encountering it, it seemed so perfectly suited for unique material, for unique content, unique setting, unique adventures. No need to go back to Baldur's Gate. No need to go back to the Forgotten Realms. Screw Drizzt. He's done, right? All that's old. If you're going to be new, be new. That's kind of where I can see. I'm again being very idealistic. They're not going to give up 30 years of intellectual property.
Obviously not.
But still,
if anything, they've stepped up that in 5th edition, because 5th edition is literally chock full of literally quotes from Dragonlance and Salvatore novels. I think they actually they use some of the side characters from the Drizzt novels as as examples how you build your character.
Right. That's fascinating because again, being so old, it's hilarious to call Forgotten Realms material old school. To me, is crazy. I'm like, what do you mean old school? So but of course that's ridiculous. That's just, I mean, this is where I go off to the old people home, and they they pet me on the head and say yes. So I get that. But you said
you can have your
I know
Gene Wolfe.
Yeah, exactly. What are you gonna read? Go read a Jack Vance novel. Shut up. So, but tell me, you had two things though you were going to say.
Yeah, just as you were talking, kind of two things popped into my head. One was you said that you were reading the Dungeon Master's Guide 2 and the Player's Handbook 3 or something, right?
More or less, yeah.
So usually, I think as a edition of D&D progresses through its life cycle,
Right.
basically the designers themselves kind of start to learn more about their game.
Right. Right. That's true.
So
Well, I
when you
can tell you
said
that
that
as a designer myself and publisher myself. Absolutely. Yeah.
when you said that the Dungeon Master's Guide 2 was like more flexible and stuff, you can probably see how they started to realize what they actually created.
What have I done? Yes.
We can do all this stuff now.
Right.
Like, you
Right.
know.
The first Dungeon Master's Guide is pretty obsessed with skirmishing,
Mm,
and also with I mean with their examples of skill challenges are really childish and uninteresting, and they're kind of like you don't really see why you would do it. It just seems like it's not very compelling. In the second Dungeon Master's Guide, you can see how a character might say, you know, that guy we're about to fight, I want to make him my friend. And if the
mhm.
character was, for example, neutral, then the skill challenge wouldn't be very hard. You'd still have to do it, but you could actually turn a foe into a friend that way, and so it was a lot more interesting.
So that was just one thought, and the other one was when you said that they kept all this Forgotten Realms stuff. Like I said, they actually stepped it up in fifth edition, and I think in fourth edition they actually tried to get a bit away from that. Because
Yeah.
from my personal, of course, they didn't go far enough, as you say, obviously, but from my personal experience as being part of that third edition crowd, when fourth edition came out, people were extremely upset that there was a new setting, basically, implied setting.
Right.
Was this Nantir Vale or something
Well,
that they
I
used?
remember in the Dungeon Master's Guide there was a little piece about it, but that's about
Yeah,
it.
I mean, it's not like a revolutionary new thing. It's a pretty bog standard
Right.
fantasy thing with elves and dwarves, but it was basically a new setting. And they introduced stuff like tieflings were now a playable race, and
Right.
dragonborn were now a playable race. And people were like, what is new? This new stuff? I'm upset.
It's just
I
kind of
can't handle
hilarious
this.
that would be upsetting. I mean, but that's just me.
Yeah, like
Uh-huh.
I can, I still can't understand people who like get really upset changes to the like canonical material. You
Well,
know, you
especially
can,
when the canonical material really isn't all that old. I mean,
yeah, or
I mean,
even it's just like,
you could play tieflings in Planescape. How hard is that?
yeah, exactly.
Um,
And so, yeah, it's interesting how basically this perception of fourth edition as being kind of too different actually from the Forgotten Realms was part of the negative reaction in my experience back in the
okay.
day.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, for me, like the campaigns that we play with my friends are completely just psychedelic. Also,
Right. Right.
world hopping, god killing,
That's what
insane
that's what
stuff.
I'm doing right now, and I'm having a blast. One of the standard responses is, of course, the World of Warcraft comparison.
Yeah,
The argument that this is just a video game on paper. Now, I am the only person I've ever heard say what I'm about to say, and maybe I'm just not listening to the right other people talking. Maybe what I'm saying is completely normal, but it seems very straightforward to me. All of the video game traditions, of which World of Warcraft is a very late stage. I said video, you know what I mean. All these interactive interfaces. And World of Warcraft is a very late version of something that's been going on for a long time. Well, where did that thing come from?
from D&D.
From D&D, tabletop D&D. And from somebody who actually had some contact, not much because I didn't like it then, but who fully understood the tournament context of early D&D. That's exactly what it was like. And so what strikes me as weird is that I look at fourth edition, and if that accusation were true, and I maintain that it's not really very true in the fullness of what I'm looking at, but even if it were completely true, that would be the oldest possible old school of Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
So I'm that this is, as I say, I have not found that particular argument prominently displayed anywhere. But it just seems so strange for somebody to say, "Oh, this is terrible," You're dungeon crawling and killing mercilessly. How dare you? That's not Dungeons and Dragons. And I spent my entire first 20 years in role playing with that very thing being synonymous with Dungeons and Dragons. So and so it's just again,
It's really funny.
this is where I'm kind of like in a state of almost, maybe I left and came back to a different dimension or something. you know. So
What's the thing? The Bernstein Bears
right,
thing.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually know of one other person who made this argument that
Oh,
you made.
excellent. Thank God.
I would need to go dig through the forums and everything. I don't want to misquote them, but this is supposedly somebody who actually played with Gygax.
Yeah.
He has credentials, so to
Right.
speak,
Right.
about old school D&D. And he said, if I remember correctly, exactly the same thing, that basically World of Warcraft was the same thing as they used to play back in the day with
Mm-hmm.
Gygax.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
this accusation that fourth edition is like World of Warcraft is, yeah,
it's kind of trivial
it's
if true.
convoluted.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a weird thing, but again, the culture has adopted its own terms, and old school today has its own precise and modern meaning or group of
Especially in
meanings.
the context of
Right.
the OSR and so on.
Sure. Well, that's what I mean. And one of my most recent video in Finding D&D addresses that very much
Mm,
like fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is
mm,
all about the texts, except it's all about the text the way we want the text to be.
mhm.
And so it's a little bit like that. And I've noted that anybody's definition of old school is defined by when they were 14 years old, that particular person. So the argument that I'm interested in right now is to say, what if we get away from the entire notion of is it or isn't it Dungeons and Dragons? Just get away from that. I mean, let's be really blasphemous and point out that Dungeons and Dragons is an IP. It's nothing but an intellectual property logo that has been pasted on, at least 9 different distinct games. And if you expand it out to Judges Guild and related material and then to OGL material, we're talking upwards of
Pathfinder,
20
etc.
to 40 different, easily 40 different titles. So
Mm,
therefore, let's just get away from that and say, screw it. We don't care. I don't care whether it's D&D or not. I have no
mhm.
stake in this. The question is, what kind of game are we looking at? And what kind of enjoyment are we looking at? And what kind of potential for further play are we looking at? I don't care if something's out of print or not. I'm playing RuneQuest from 1980 right now. And I staunchly deny that there exists anything called a dead game. I am not a consumer, I am a practitioner. There's a difference.
Mm,
I don't have to I don't have to have a stake in something in these commercial terms. So therefore, what are we really looking at? And that's what I'm interested in hearing from you too. When you talk about how you played it, and you're interested in kind of the context of what it was as a phenomenon, like I am too. From that perspective, we really should be thinking about what kind of game is it? What kind of role playing? What are we doing when we play this? And there may be different answers for different people. I'd like to know what they are, especially people who are actually enjoying it.
um, well, yeah, when you said you're not looking at it as a product and stuff.
Right.
This is a thing I often see online when people start saying, "Oh yeah, this game is not supported anymore,"
Man, I've
meaning
been hearing that. I've been
the
hearing that
publisher is not
forever.
putting out expansions and adventures for it. So what?
Exactly. Exactly.
Like
No, this is
who cares?
yeah, this is a very important point, and it speaks a great deal to the consumerism. People who consider themselves role players or gamers, or if you want to expand it out a little bit, geeks or nerds or anything like that. Well, that's wonderful. I will be perfectly happy to manufacture little stickers, and I will sell people stickers to put on themselves if they'll give me money. If they want to do that, that's fine. What I care about is, well, what I'm pointing out is that what's the point if all it means is that you're identifying yourself as a target market? And so, I mean, I don't mean to be too geographic. I should explain. You're talking to a politically radical American who just exiled himself to Sweden. So, you know, so I should probably stop here.
Yeah, I mean, like I've been sort of ranting about the same things on G Plus occasionally, also about the current craze about certain like cinema, for example.
Of course. Yeah.
You have this attitude where everything that comes out that's kind of nerdy or geeky is accepted with great applause and like, wow, this was amazing. No, it was a shit movie,
Right.
but because we're
Or the
nerds, we're
latest
supposed to
Netflix
like it,
series, for example.
or
Exactly. Yeah.
whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. My
But yeah, going back.
yeah, my argument these has always been really for a very long time. I wait. I always wait until the season is over and they've got all excited about something else. And then I'll go and watch
So
it.
you
And
can
when nobody's listening, and nobody cares, if I post it, they would say, "Why are you doing that? It's over." And so I don't post, and then I can just see if I like it. I can just enjoy it or not. And so that's kind of been my solution. And I even scold my friends. They try to say, "You have to see this." And I'm like, "Well, why?
because you're not.
What does that have to? What's this? Last time someone said have to, they were trying to poison myself with too many shots of, vodka. I don't. So anyway,
Uh,
so therefore, I can be very arrogant about this because I'm irritated. But
mm,
what I want to get at though is let's get back to the game itself and
yeah.
what I mean when you played it and you were talking about the god slaying and the world hopping. I mean that turns me on. Tell me more. You know.
Uh, well, just going back a step for a second, ignoring this commercial aspect of D&D, what I've come to see the game of D&D as, when you said like, what is this game, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is this thing? If it's not an IP, because you have very different practices of playing D&D, as I think you wrote at least one essay about that.
Yeah.
You have kind of this railroading, storytelling kind of play where the DM is just revealing the plot and the players are just kind of tagging along. Or you have this very hardcore challenge-based D&D. There are different approaches to playing it. So what I've come to see D&D as is just some kind of framework.
Right. Actually, I was thinking about fourth edition as a game.
Okay,
if we were
but
just to
yeah,
take that and forget the name, maybe it had a different name, and then say,
yeah,
okay,
it's
this is
basically
what
just,
that.
this is also why I think D&D is synonymous with role playing in the end. When you see
That's
it
part of
talked
my
about in the
argument.
meaning.
Yeah. Yeah. That.
And then you get fourth edition, and fourth edition says, oh, but yeah, this is just some kind of loose framework where you can do whatever. Let's do something where you do a specific thing and you do it well. And people are like, what the hell?
Right.
We don't want that.
Right. Well, maybe not. Yeah, a number of people didn't, and it's clear. I mean, Pathfinder makes it clear that, for the first time, the IP split. And so the it's very clear that people identified with the former way to play. Pathfinder is so beautifully named too, in terms of that storytelling type thing. And I'm going to give the creators credit. Um, I will actually give them some serious credit. They never lie about that. The Pathfinder line, the Pathfinder brand does not lie about what it's doing. It doesn't claim anything except this is what we do. And what you just described, it says, yeah, that's true. We have our story, and yes, you do tag along. And guess what? It's a lot of fun to do it. We'll do that. Now, I grant you, it's not my kind of fun, but they are honest about what it is. And I
And
hope, yeah,
obviously, lots of people
sure,
are into that because
absolutely,
it's
yeah.
commercially
Yeah,
successful.
I
So yeah.
completely get that. Well, so taking a look at fourth edition, what is interesting to me is that if you were to play it very simplistically, so it doesn't matter if you are a warlord or a cleric, you're still just a leader. It doesn't matter if you are a, um, this kind of striker or that kind of striker, whatever. And it matters a little which kind of controller, because there's a little more variation there, but really not very much. Well, it starts to be a lot more interesting when you, instead of trying to play the whole rule book at once, if instead you start to pick things and create a subset, which is what I did. You saw I picked four,
Yeah.
four races, and I picked three classes plus two hybrid classes you could use and we're supposed to use. So I almost created my own very tight little framework there. And I'll tell you, there's another one that I haven't released yet. I haven't played it yet for fourth edition. And I made another one of those. And this one, okay, it's all of the religious classes, the divine classes. So you've got the
Mhm.
cleric as the leader, the paladin as the defender, the avenger as the striker, and the invoker as the controller. And those are the only classes, except for one other, that you cannot play as a primary. You can only multi-class with it. You can't hybridize. Only one other class, and you can multi-class with it from one of the others. Warlock.
Warlock. Okay.
Right.
Okay. Cool.
So, and then there's only two races available: human,
Hmm?
tiefling. Are you starting to see it?
Yeah, I'm
The
seeing where
whole
this is going.
setting
Yeah.
is nothing but the grand uber church of all the cosmos. So every alignment, every canonical religion that they've got in the book is available as part
Mm.
of this monstrous cosmic church. And so that would be the context for play. And I'm looking at this and I'm really kind of excited about it. It's actually pretty intense. And it strikes me, I mean, if you look across all of that diversity of material that they've got, and instead of just saying, well, pick from these 25 classes with, each one with a binary or triple set of subdivisions, but really only four classes: leader, striker, defender, and
Mm.
whatchamacallit, controller. So instead of doing that, and then the nice thing about that too is that you're no longer worrying about optimizing so much. I always thought that optimizing race to class was bullshit for fourth edition. You only get a couple more pluses. It's
Mm.
not that big a deal, to pick the perfect race for that class. It's not that big a deal. It doesn't really, you get a few pluses, but compared to the kind of pluses you get from good tactics, it's not very much. So I don't know. So, but the point is, to specify like this, you end up with there's no way to try to look across all the options and find that one perfect +6 +6 combination. Forget it. You're not going to do it. You have to pick
Mm.
what's here, not what's across all the books. And I have been finding that, as you can see, I hope, with my current game and then with this other idea, I think you can see some pretty interesting things. The range of Paragon and the range of Epic then becomes an extremely, it's not very tight. There's still a lot of options, but it becomes extremely exciting. It's not any Paragon class, it's these 15 Paragons that we'll be picking
Mhm.
from. And you look across them and you're like, wow, so that's what greatness looks like. And it has a flavor, it has a feel.
Mhm.
It has, and I find fourth edition far more compelling as with its potential to do that. than any of the other editions. So I don't know, maybe this is a matter of me hacking it, you know? This is sort of adding this step of preparation. You're basically creating your own sub game by picking like this, but I'm not really breaking any of the rules. And the distinctions among the rule subsets are interesting. In the current game, what I'm calling barbaric psychedelic, it's all the psionics. So all of the PowerPoint's rules matter a lot for us. And alignment doesn't mean very much at all in this. But over in the divine one, it's all about the domains. The domain rules take on such strength that they effectively become almost the primary long-term power set. And so I'm finding the game is actually very rewarding in terms of system when I do this. You discover something that would have been some boring, some detail that's mixed up with too many other things, but now it becomes a primary feature of play. And so I don't know. I almost, in many ways, of all the manifold things that I could be doing with my time, I'm almost tempted to use the open game license to create my own way to do this as kind of a dedicated line of publication.
Fourth edition Heartbreaker.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, heartbreakers are only heartbreakers if you're dumb about
I know.
Yeah, but yeah, in many ways, it. I almost wish that this creative effort that had gone into fourth edition had been spent somewhere else under a different IP, under a different promotional model, and just so it could have been enjoyed as a game. And I actually heard this from a couple of other people recently. Actually, some very, very OSR people were telling me the same thing. They were kind of like, it's kind of tragic. There's really nothing wrong with it as a game. It's all about identity. And the admission, I don't think anybody would have admitted that 10 years ago. All the rage was going on and all of this. Everybody was in battle. But now, 10 years later, even people who very fervently identify with the OSR and whose publications are usually front and center quoted about it, even they are saying, you know what? That's actually a pretty good game.
The conversation has kind of moved past that original negative reaction. Yeah.
Right. Well, to some extent, there are some people, of course, who have made their careers on that rage, and they're not going to give it up. But who cares?
There are also people who are angry that fourth edition was ultimately axed.
That's an interesting thing. I don't really look across the whole internet for all the different opinions. God help me if I ever set foot in Reddit or Dragon's Foot, or anything like that. It's not. But tell me more about that. Is what I'm really saying.
Well, I haven't had any instances of that, but I know that after fifth edition was announced, quite a lot of people were upset, and as the fifth edition playtests were coming through, I saw comments on the forums that, oh no, they're moving back to the old school model. The fighter is gonna be weak and the wizard is gonna be strong again. That kind of argument. So I don't know if that is still a thing, but when fifth edition was announced, that I saw it in the forums here and there.
No, it's to me past the point of, again, the identity thing of we're not really talking about whether it's a good game or not. We're talking about what D&D should be like. And at that point, we're not talking about preferences of play. We're not talking about anything except this more complicated cultural approach to things.
Did you follow the fifth edition playtest at all?
No,
Probably
really.
not.
No.
Because their basically their motto was they were just kind of throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks, releasing various rule changes here and there. And basically they were saying, does this feel like D&D to you?
Huh. Interesting. Yeah.
So what you just said about like, does this, feel right? Does this feel like D&D? That was their main like metric of judging how successful the playtest is.
Right. Well, it's a kind of an interesting trick. The all the way back in 20 years ago, and I
Hmm.
don't know who said this, whether it was Monty Cook or whether it was Ryan Dancy. I think it was in the Wizards design and promotion team though. They the quote that came from there, and it might have been told to me directly. I don't even remember if I read it or what. So it's a terrible anecdote. I can't name drop properly. But the point is, but the content was great. And it said, we realized that we weren't, this isn't a game, this is a culture.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
And so I think that they were, they were quite precise in their thinking about what they were trying to do. And my other kind of, uh, my other kind of question about fourth edition is how, or observation, is how many times I've mentioned it. And it reminds me a little bit about role playing back in the 80s. Okay. Back in the 80s, if you were a role player, you didn't say it because so many people, like parents groups, hated Dungeons and Dragons, and it had very bad cultural presence. It was something that losers did in my high school and college context, or at least that's what a lot of people said. But what was interesting was that if you admitted it and said it in front of everybody, as we say in English, in front of God and everybody, right? The response would almost always be the same thing. Somebody would come up to you and say later, "I used to play. I used to role play. Do you play? Do you still play? Could I play?"
Hmm.
But they would wait, they'd come up to you individually and tell you that. And so the same thing happens with fourth edition right now. When I was at a big group gaming event in Chicago a few years ago, where
Hmm.
I used to live in the Chicago area, and I went to a big gaming event, and all these people were there, and everybody's talking, and I said, I just discovered fourth edition, and I'm kind of interested in it, and I played a little at this game store, and I'm kind of interested in setting up something a little weird myself with it. And it was the same reaction. At first, it was fourth edition, ew, sucks, blah blah blah, and everybody, talks like that. And I just waited, or I didn't wait. I discovered sooner or later I had a gaming group right out of those same people. They all came up one by one and said, it's kind of it was almost like a drug. Everybody
Hmm.
immediately says how terrible it is. Nobody, why would you do that terrible thing? Terrible, terrible, drugs, awful. Nobody should do drugs. Say no to drugs. And then somebody comes up to you a little later and says, "You got any?" It was exactly the same. And that's so I kind of wonder, and that's why your G plus post interested me, because it seemed to me like another example of a few people are brave enough to admit that they do this drug,
Hmm.
or that they do this thing, and then other people, a few other people will sort of, I like talking about that thing. I'm
Hmm.
interested in that thing. What did you do with the thing? How was what was your experience like? And I guess I feel maybe I'm such a pain in the ass, but I feel a mischievous urge to cultivate this, you know. Um, and part of it's just appreciation for the design of the game as I see it. which I think is far more than the World of Warcraft stereotype. There's some really good ideas in there as far as
Mm.
play is concerned. They are very focused, that's true, but they're not one dimensional. So, as I see it. So,
Well,
well, a good example, for example, is their approach to alignment, which is really, really interesting. It's not like any other kind of alignment. And the way it interfaces with the different choices you make about play that I was talking about, it's not trivial. It's interesting.
yeah,
Um,
there's definitely a lot of interesting design choices there. And like, can we talk about the design on fourth edition specifically, maybe a bit?
sure, yeah,
Because like one of the comments I also see along with the World of Warcraft references is, oh, you don't do anything outside combat, for example, or you don't. There's no support for what happens outside combat because all of the powers are focused on combat, right?
possibly.
But
There's
then,
a number that aren't, in my opinion, but there's a lot of things about skill use, and the
but
skills are actually pretty focused. I like the fact that there are few skills, but
but
the
exactly that's what I was gonna say. That
yeah,
if you look at a game like Pathfinder and you take, I don't know, like the fighter,
right,
any of the fighter's class abilities are just for combat. There's
right,
no out of
right.
combat abilities on
I
there.
I would
It's,
be I would cannot speak for second edition, which is a sprawling mess of maybe three or four different game systems all thrown into one place. But
mm,
for anything before second edition, everything you just said is a perfectly good criticism. There is nothing but combat.
and
And
fourth edition, ironically, is the first edition that actually has some kind of framework for conflict resolution outside
yeah,
combat. The
right,
skill
right.
challenges,
Right, that's true. Now,
which
I was just thinking I was being a little bit unfair. One of the things that is kind of interesting about the older D&Ds is the
mm,
interesting role of time, magic item creation, and the spending of money. I just realized I was being a little unfair. Once you get up to those high levels, so I'm not talking about
mm,
like buying things and talking and out of combat interaction.
no, no, I'm
I'm
talking
talking about
about
these
stuff like,
large level what characters do with their time.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And so, there were materials available. I'm not sure they were always very coherent, but they were available to talk about it. It was clear people thought about their characters in that way.
mm,
So I don't want to be too unfair, but you're right, and I completely agree that if we're looking at character specific class abilities, the things that you cultivated as your character developed, if you looked at those, it was pretty much all how you did in combat, what your saving rolls were like, and what magic items you had. That's what I was in, you know. So I agree. It seems like a strange criticism, especially relative to the capabilities of the system itself. Now,
mm,
one thing that comes to mind about that, all time in fourth edition is parceled into extended rests, short rests, and no rests. All time. Now, in some ways, you could say, therefore, that the bulk of the character's fictional lives is spent in the context of an extended rest. Now, that seems a little weird until you start thinking about stuff like rituals. That's another subset of the rules, which is grossly undervalued, I think. If you look at the rituals, you see that they should be treated as encounters. And therefore,
mm,
the DMs should think, well, if this guy wants to do the ritual, either we just do the ritual and it's a very non-conflicty encounter. It still has, roles and things in it, or it can be in and of itself at the heart of a much more problematic encounter situation with
mm,
foes and
mm,
things like that. I mean, it takes a long time to set up a ritual. It takes a lot, sometimes it takes preparing in other ways that other characters might notice. The idea that somebody shows up to either co opt or to disrupt your ritual for reasons of their own, and that you might know who that person is. It's not random. It's not a surprise. It actually makes sense, you know, that I want to do this ritual, but this guy's here and I know what he thinks about that, you know.
Yeah,
And so
it
all
gives
those
you
things are
interesting
right. I mean, so really,
options and stuff.
the
Yeah.
use of time is actually fairly developed in the game, and it's a little strange, I have to admit. I mean, okay, short rests, extended rest, this much healing, that much healing, this power comes back, that power comes back. It's a little bit strange, but as a framework for overall play, especially since extended rest and day are almost simultaneous. If you take an extended rest, then the day passes. So daily, right, is an overall.
Mm,
It's they're not absolutely synonymous, but they're related. And so it seems to me that if you set up an adventure circumstance where time matters, what happens, and if you don't deal with it within a certain passage of time, what will happen? And you have lots of things happening like that, then the time framework of the game actually becomes exciting.
mm,
And so all of these to me seem high potential, you know, a way to make a scenario exciting, a way to make do I or don't I use this power exciting, and pressing on. I've been trying to use this. I've been claiming to use pressing on versus not pressing on as an important aspect of what we're doing in our game. I'm not DMing it very well. I'm trying, but I'm not really I'm not preparing well enough to actually have a flow chart of what happens if they do or don't do that extended rest. You know, stuff like that. I should be more
I,
careful about that to make it more fun.
I think very few, excuse me, very few DMs are actually prepared to go to that length of preparation, I think.
I know, but
Especially
you
if you're
know,
used to, like us, to like more indie games, after you've
right.
played stuff with very little preparation, you're used to improvising and stuff like that. Then you come to a game like 4th edition, and suddenly, oh, I need to prepare all these encounters. Oh my God, I can't
I know,
deal with
but
this stuff.
I'm actually coming up with a pretty good method for that that's a little less painful. There's a couple of different things. I've explained them a little bit in some of my consulting. There's one of the people I'm consulting for is doing an OGL with 5th edition.
Okay.
So he and I are spending a lot of time talking about the different options for design and stuff like that. What he can do with the freedom of the open game license regarding that rule set and what he wants to do with it. But his biggest concern is anxiety and exhaustion about preparation. And I think there are some interesting angles. There are some interesting best practices or usable practices that would make, for example, preparing a level's worth of increase, a level's worth of advancement, kind of fun. You know, more like making a big landscape of
Hmm.
different characters, different problems, different priorities. There's no way you can just start at one end and kill your way to the other end. You're going to have to take sides. You're going to have to choose what to do, and it would be very open to the player's choices of what they do, when, and for whom, and therefore the extended rests become important because they mean that other characters can be doing things.
Okay, yeah, that
That's
sounds
yeah,
very
and
exciting. Yeah.
and though I'm doing that right now, and one of the things that I'm doing with it too is in 4th edition, it's so structured. If you do it the default way, you need 10 party level encounters, and that's a level. I don't know about you, but that's a lot. That's a lot. And in 2nd edition, I mean, I don't know if it's in first, I mean, first, sorry, not 2nd edition. In the first Dungeon Master's Guide, or maybe in the second, it says cut that in half if you want. Okay, 5 encounters, party level encounters. That might not be so bad. Let's think about this because a major quest counts as an encounter. Huh.
Okay.
So if I throw in a few possible major quests in there, thinking that they'll probably happen upon one or announce one of their own, 4 encounters. Okay. A skill challenge, a good solid hard one of the party's level, counts as an encounter.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, and also, especially with the second Dungeon Master's Guide in hand, you can convert a combat into a skill challenge if you're smart enough, and bearing in mind that a failed skill challenge should have severe consequences. It shouldn't just be a way out of combat, right? Win or lose. And also that if you're in the middle of a skill challenge that you screw it up or decide you hate the guy, it can become a combat. So, okay. This is sounding a lot more like open-ended preparation now. If I set up enough potential dangers and enough potential opportunities, they'll get a level's worth out of this.
Mm-hmm.
Not too badly, not without too much trouble. And with that kind of flexibility and play at hand, and then keeping an eye on the time, that all of a sudden keeping an eye on extended rests and how many days and all that starts to be interesting. So, I'm working my way through this painfully. In other words, I do it badly. And then the next time, the next level, I say, well, maybe I'll do it a little better. I'll be better at it. I'll know what to prep for a little better. So maybe after a few levels, I'll be pretty good at this. And so I'm building those skills right now. That's what, so it's,
when you're approaching a new game, like DMing a new game or GMing a new game, you have to sort of build up to the.
Absolutely. I mean, that if it's, I'm a big believer in learning curves. I don't like the idea that you open the game and it jumps out of the box and takes care of you. I mean, I know that there's, especially in the indie culture at the moment, there's kind of a push for that sort of thing. And it's kind of tricky because I agree that a game should be fun from the beginning. But on the other hand, this isn't candy. You don't just tear off the wrapper and eat it. This is a skilled activity, more like playing musical instruments. Nobody expects to be good at a musical instrument. You just hope that it's fun from the beginning. But you don't expect to be really admirably good at it. You
need to be prepared to put some effort into it.
Yeah, and also to recognize that, your first sounds may not be, all that awesome. That's okay. So anyway, those are some of my thoughts. I really appreciate you taking the time, because talking it out like this helps me put these things into a clearer form.
Yeah, when you're talking to another person, it helps you like to actually articulate the things that are kind of percolating in your head. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge topic. There's literally hours of material to discuss. So.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate the time you took. I'd like to hear more about that game sometime. You should.
Well, I can just tell you real quick what we've been doing. We just kind of started doing this many years ago, where basically we started a campaign of DnD, and from the start it's set up as a kind of how to explain it. Basically, the characters are strangers in a strange land, so they have no ties to any local stuff or anything. They're new, or amnesiac or something. And then basically we switch DMs every session. So every DM that comes next, first of all, you already have kind of a lot of material that the previous DM introduced. So it's easier for you to build upon that.
But it's up to you. Second, you can do whatever you want with it.
Yeah, right. Exactly. We kind of lifted our hands from the whole concept of like authorship and like who owns what.
Right.
And just every time you're DM, you're in control and can do whatever with the things that were introduced previously. So on one hand, you have a lot of material from the previous DMs that introduced stuff for you, so it's easier to improvise and build upon that. And on the other hand, you also like kind of want to top their efforts.
Yeah, right.
Because like previous session was really fun. Yeah, this is a really great game. This is great combat we had. And then next session you're the DM, and you're like, damn, I need to make a
I better
better combat
I
than the
better be pretty
previous
good
guy.
at combat. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So it's basically almost like taking the whole concept of like challenge play to the DM's role as well, in some sense.
No, it's actually very fruitful. Rotating DMs or
Mm,
GMs has been a troublesome question in play for
yeah,
a
it
while.
is.
But the I'm trying to think of the first text where I encountered it chronologically. It's explicit in the game by Greg Stafford, Prince Valiant, in 1989.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Where he says, why don't you just trade? Everybody has knights. Why don't you just trade out who's the GM? And it's also kind of interesting that in that game, the GM is very much a he has specific tasks. He or she has specific tasks. They're not
Mm,
they're very episodic. They're very much like this night, these nights, this particular problem, this village, what happens. It's very episodic, and you don't really have to worry about a big plan. Um, the It's not like Pendragon, which is nothing but this monstrous epic. But Prince Valiant's about the fairly two-dimensional but admirable characters dealing with an interesting thematic set of problems. It's a great game, really. But he said, yeah, just go ahead. Anybody who wants to be the GM for next time, prepare something. You all know how to do it. It's not hard. Just,
that's great.
have fun. And I'm sure that that may not have been the first. Somebody's going to say, but what about this? But I don't
Mm,
think I encountered it before 1989. Not as a
I mean,
text, not as a role playing
I
text.
I read Prince Valiant some time ago, but I don't actually remember reading this part about changing the GMs. But yeah, anyway, like we started doing this thing. It just kind of clicked for our group.
Yeah, it's
I know
great.
lots of people have problems with it, but for us it worked. And
Hmm.
kind of by necessity, because the DMs are changing and everybody's introducing their new stuff, the concept kind of emerges that reality is kind of
Right,
malleable or
right.
disintegrating.
It lends itself very well to a heavy metal context of
Yeah,
fantasy. So
exactly.
yeah,
And then inevitably you get into very like gonzo
right,
weird
right,
stuff with colliding realities and multiverses and gods trying to create new realities, and then you
right,
kill the god because you
right,
wanna
right.
dibs on that and stuff like that.
I
So
think
yeah.
that's just fantastic. I would love it if you would post about that sometime at its play.
I've
Just
been
write a little
thinking
bit.
about writing something about it for ages, but yeah,
Yeah.
I need to
It
find the
seems like
time.
so much to write about, but even if you wrote about a little piece, then it becomes easier to talk about it.
Mm,
So I invite you to do it for sure because that's just fun. Cool. Well,
okay.
thank you very much for taking all this time.
Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you for inviting me and
yeah, it was very enjoyable.
discussing this
Yeah.
stuff. Okay.
Well, good night.
Have a nice evening,
Yeah,
and we'll talk again, I
yeah.
guess.
I really enjoyed it. Take care, Gordon. Take care.
Take care. Bye.